I don't know about liberating women with artificial wombs. That's not an option, so I don't have to consider it. But we do want to liberate women from being the sole bearers of the burden of
Yeah,
having to deal with the ethical question of whether or not children are legitimate
yeah.
and the personal question within couples of whether or not we're going to have any kids.
Hmm. Hey, so where is everybody? Rachel, where are you? Anastasia, I'm in Massachusetts, just north of Boston. Where are you sitting this morning?
I'm in London.
And
It's the Northeast.
Where are you, Rachel?
I'm in Chicago.
And you're in London,
Uh-huh.
Anastasia?
That's right.
Why did I think somebody was in Israel? Maybe
We were in Israel before.
who's we?
Me and my family.
Oh, okay, good. Because there was something came across and it was like, oh, I wonder where everybody's going to be calling in from. And we're doing it a weird time and we made Ernie get up early because he lives out there in the desert. You know, this has taken a lot of work here.
And this is how we wrote the book too, across time differences, mostly over Zoom and Skype. So
Yeah.
now
Well,
we're bringing you in.
good. And the book came out June 11.
Yes.
And I read it. I'm well prepared. I have a lot of notes. And sadly, I don't have a hard copy because usually what I do with books that I get the hard copy from instead of on Kindle is I show the author how well dog-eared it is. That's somebody else's book, but you're going to believe me because I've got wonderful quotes and citations from the book and so enjoyed reading it.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good piece of work. Of the various books I've written, I've co-authored three. One was with my son John, called Keeping Faith, a father-son story about love in the United States Marine Corps. And then two others were on the relationship of the military to family. And I wrote those with Kathy Roth-Touquet, who was one of Hillary Clinton's people. And we did that one long distance. And then, of course, with John, we wrote that based on his boot camp letters to me. And so we had kind of written some of that, but actually I was working on that when he was in Afghanistan getting shot at, and I was finishing the book up. And when we had started it, it was in 1999, and the Marine Corps thing was sort of a lark. And then, of course, 9/11 happened, and 2 minutes later, he's at war. And I'm editing this book, thinking to myself, this is horrible now because it's also real. What am I doing working on a book? Well, suddenly this whole thing has gone dark and he's over there in danger. So that was a very odd experience. It kind of fits in with your book in the sense that, what are children for? And at that point in my life, what they were for was keeping me up all night and a lot of worry. So I don't know why I'm telling you all that, but your book really touched me in a lot of ways, and we'll get into that. And I just want to get one thing straight in terms of who initiated the book, and then talk about that a little bit. But first, let me introduce you both properly, and we will go for it. Okay. This is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching and/or listening to my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. My guests are Anastasia Berg and Rachel Wiseman. Anastasia Berg is assistant professor of philosophy at the University of California, Irvine, and editor of Point Magazine. Rachel Wiseman is managing editor of Point Magazine. Now, did I get that right? Are you both something to do with Point Magazine?
We are. That's how we met. In fact.
I mean, Ernie never makes mistakes because Ernie's like a god. He's our producer. But I just saw that as I read it, thinking, I make a lot of mistakes. So I kind of check on things. Together, they are the authors of a new book, What Are Children For? Please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts. And to my Substack, it has to be said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. So I want to mention one thing up front. With your permission, both of you, this book, I think, is so important that I wanted to fold it into a book club that I do called It Has to Be Read, which is also part of my podcast and commentary family of offerings online. And we would like to bump it up usually we wait and, we're doing October, November, December schedules now, but I'd like people to be reading this in July if it's okay. And so we would like to make this one of our It Has to Be Read book club offerings, which means we can re-promote it and really get behind it. And if that's okay with you, does that fit with you, what you all would like to do? Can we do that in July and push the hell out of it?
Sounds great.
We'd love that. Thank you so much.
Okay, good. All right. So let me get to the first question I have, which is just a nuts and bolts question. How did this book come to be, in the sense of how long have you all known each other? As I mentioned, when we were just chit-chatting, I've co-authored a couple of books, and I always had a connection with the author in some way. Give us a little bit of the history of how the book came about.
Yeah, so Anastasia and I met through this literary magazine that we edit together. I was the first employee, I write about this a little bit in the intro, the first employee at this literary magazine, and Anastasia came on as a new editor. And it completely changed my experience of working at the magazine. Suddenly, everything that we were doing was just imbued with this sense of like urgency and meaning. And we had these ongoing conversations about the work at the magazine, but also about our lives, and we became good friends. Around the same time, the magazine was publishing an issue on what are children for, and she and I started talking, and we felt very frustrated by the narratives that we saw in the media about why millennials weren't having children, whether it was okay for them to have children today. And so she and I discussed this, both kind of on a political and social level, but also personally. And we felt that the kinds of conversations that we wanted to have about this weren't really available in the public sphere.
Yeah.
And either you would get these very kind of first personal, hyper-subjective motherhood ambivalence type narratives,
Yeah.
or you would get these extremely broad strokes, historical grand narratives about, declining sperm counts or women's rising education levels.
Sure.
And none of that felt like it really touched on the core of the experience for us. And we felt that there wasn't really a space for this public conversation, and we wanted to create that. So we wrote an editorial together as part of the magazine. And in that process, we realized that we were only scratching the surface. It wasn't just these like, this general leeriness about climate change, although that's a core facet of the experience, but so many other considerations, material concerns, material and financial concerns, romantic concerns, feminist concerns.
Yeah.
And so we felt that there was a lot more that we could explore. And Anastasia was the one, I think, who first brought up, why don't we write a book about this? Let's do a proposal. And I said, can we do that? What would that look like? And I think that was really the start of it.
So what's your personal history in terms of how long you all have known each other besides this professional connection? Does it go back before that, or did you meet when you hired each other somehow?
Well, so we both have a connection to U Chicago. That's where I went to undergrad, and Anastasia went to grad school. And when I was in undergrad, we didn't know each other, but she was like the cool philosophy girl. And her reputation preceded her. So it was when we started at the magazine that we ended up becoming very close friends.
When were you all at the University of Chicago?
I was there from 2008 to 2012.
Okay.
And I was there from 2009, which is when I graduated from college, and then all the way to 2017, because grad school takes forever.
I asked because you may have overlapped my son, John, who was the Marine who, when he came back from Afghanistan, applied to only one school, which was the University of Chicago.
Oh, wow.
And was
As you should.
As he should, yes. And we all liked the University of Chicago and was accepted there. And then got married, apropos of your book, to someone he had known in high school who had finished college, because he went right into the Marines out of high school, came out of the University of Chicago, where he did extremely well, by the way, and lives across the street from me with 3 of my 5 youngest grandchildren, for whom I and my wife, Jeannie, have done childcare for the last 15 years. So we are in the next the next overture of family life, in that I read your book through the eyes of someone who has been a parent, but is also highly involved on a daily basis with doing pickups from school and cooking for these kids, and getting texts from my 15-year-old granddaughter who says, Mom and Dad are both at work. Could you cook us lunch? This is after school is out, and this kind of thing.
Mm.
So that, that's the context I'm reading in. All right. Well, thanks for the personal history. Now let me just jump into the book itself. And first of all, say that I found the book incredibly not only well written, and interesting, but there was material in there which was a good combination of personal narrative and your own history and your experiences with really eye-opening, I guess you could call it a study through your interviews with people and looking at statistics of what is going on with just relationships, irrespective of whether anybody wants to have a child or not. So I want to start with a quote. Let me see. I don't know where this is from. This is from like page 86 or somewhere. But as necessary as it is to acknowledge the curtailing of reproductive rights and the persistence of exclusionary pro-motherhood sentiments among conservatives, we must be able to do so while also recognizing that natalist pressures on women in progressive and liberal secular society are lifting. Once we do, we are confronted with a question. How are we to reconcile the popular assessments of our society as a pro-natalist monolith in which women find themselves under unrelenting pressure to have children, with the contravening evidence, the sociological findings, as well as women's own far more qualified testimonies? And I love that line, far more qualified testimonies. And I'm going to shut up and you're going to do most of the talking, but I just want to say one thing about this book. Far more qualified testimonies, I think, is what this book is. I love the way you look at something, whether it's the feminist view of this or that, or a pro-natalist view or an anti-natalist view, and then you kind of dig, here's what everybody's supposed to be thinking and what they've been labeled as being, but now here's what real people are thinking. Here's what the real doubts are. I love that. Your book keeps opening up another layer, which is your own discovery in a subject that everybody thinks is kind of closed. Having said that, let's talk about the point that I just read. Just that the environment in which women find themselves, families find themselves, men as well, when it comes to considering whether even to have a child or not. I'd like to get you both to talk about that a little bit, whoever wants to dive in.
Well, one of the things we found generally very surprising when we tried to expand this conversation that Rachel described, of one that we're having, the two of us, and realizing we have to expand it, we have to get other voices. And we both had in-depth interviews and we just surveyed as many people as we could. This isn't statistically demonstrative. We just wanted to have experiences sort of narrated in people's own voices. And we asked, what kind of external pressures do you feel, if at all, with regard to children?
Yeah.
And we were surprised genuinely with how many, particularly women, told us that in fact they don't feel any such pressure.
Yeah,
and it's because we started the book closer, I suppose, to where the mainstream narrative would have us be, which is at a place where it's just assumed that women experience a lot of pressure to have kids, that they're feeling guilt and shame if they don't have kids. And so we were sort of kind of, we didn't know what to make of the fact that so many people were saying not at all. And among those who said they did feel pressure, it was interesting what form that pressure took. So it would be, I get asked whether or not I want kids, which I understand could be annoying if, say, you're very ambivalent.
Yeah.
But it's different than kind of a strong mandate to have kids, or you're less of a woman, right? Just being asked. There was a lot of, sorry, Frank, but there's a lot of grandparents, prospective grandparents. So
I know, I read that in your book. I saw it and I said,
and they say,
right there.
They ask me, or I think she wants kids. I think my mother-in-law wants kids, which now, again, that could be hard when you're thinking maybe I'm about to disappoint someone. That's different than the kind of external pressures that we sort of would be led to believe women would be reporting on.
Sure.
And that for us became the beginning of an investigation. How do we reconcile the multiplicity of reports, the kind of pluralism of experiences, where on the one hand, we're hearing a lot about pronatalist society. I mean, we it sort of passes, in other passages of the book, we say people just take it for granted. We live in a very pronatalist and especially sort of motherhood pressuring society with the fact that women aren't experiencing this pressure. And what we end up concluding is not a ruling for one side or the other. It's actually to say, I think we live in both a pronatalist and an antinatalist society, which is to say that people are experiencing conflicting narratives. And moreover, because the decision has become so fraught for them, that's one of the things we want to introduce in the book. I said this decision that used to be taken for granted, it was, it was the kind of thing that you did. It was an essential part of a human life.
Sure.
Now it's something that you have to justify. Now it's something that you have to give an account of. And because it has become so fraught, because there's so much pressure against the decision and so little that people can say for it, what happens is that depending on the direction you're leaning, I think you experience a lot of worries and concerns and even pressures in the opposite direction. A lot of it, I think, we sort of hinted at the book, I think it is externalized internal conflict. So if you're leaning no, you're hyper aware of all the places that seem to be, right, sort of pro kids, where objectively we sort of want to point out, well, these don't constitute or oppressive pressures. On the other hand, a lot of people who have kids are really sensitive to the pressures not to have them, be it the popular media that, every month we have a new op-ed from the New York Times asking, is it okay to have kids during climate change? To if it's the case for especially women in kind of avant-garde professions, so the arts, academia, journalism will say, well, it's kind of tolerated, right? No one's going to tell you you're not allowed to have kids. You're allowed to do whatever you want in your body and that kind of milieu. But it's not something really celebrated. It's something that's sort of, well, it's okay if you want to. And so we want to kind of reshape the way we think about society into recognizing that this is something that it's fraught, it's in the air, and as we say, it's both pronatalist and antinatalist at one and the same time.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I love that about your book. And I want to jump to another quote here. And of course, either one of you who wants to comment on what the other is saying, please jump in too. And you don't have to go with anything I'm asking. If you have other things you want to add, please do. But I find the context of what are children for could also be rephrased within your book, because you deal with this, what is love for? And we have another quote here which takes us into that. And that is, it's not only an ambiguity in terms of, do I have a child? And that was always assumed. I think it's a step further back than that now. And you express this very well on page 53, 54, where you say, today love takes time. When looking for a soulmate, people no longer rely on blind dates or chance encounters. They cast wider nets than ever before and date across great geographical divides. They test the waters for long periods over text before meeting in person. They vet partners for financial stability and shared interests. Every stage of the relationship is drawn out. They wait longer to become, quote, official or exclusive, to move in with each other, to introduce their parents to their families, to marry, have children. In 2016 reissue of her book, Anatomy of Love, Helen Fisher, a biological anthropologist at the Kinsey Institute, who has served as an advisor for Match.com for nearly 20 years, gave these new extended courtships and practices a pithy name, quote, slow love. And then you have quite a bit on that. And I thought it was a terrific, it's not even a footnote, but it's a terrific part two to this issue of what are children for. We're in a time and place now where even, do I have a relationship or do I just have a series of sexual encounters? Is sex about love and connection, or is it just a thing, an appetite? But more than that, you bring up this idea of slow love, and then you develop this quite a bit through the text. There's a lot on this. I find that fascinating, even generationally, because I'm somebody who came out of the 60s. And, the one thing that was never questioned in the 1960s was, what is love for? it was assumed at some point you're going to have a relationship which is based on love, maybe a long-term relationship. It could be called living with someone or marriage, but these weren't questions being asked even within the counterculture. It was a thing, and the same with kind of kids. So I guess I'm asking you for the anatomy of this slow love and how that affects generationally the people you interviewed, because I know, obviously I've read the book, so I know. Go there a little bit, because I think that's an excellent kind of backdrop to the entire question of what are children for, unless I've misunderstood your book.
No, I think you understood really well. And I really like the reading of that part of the book as one that's stepping from what are children for to what is love for.
Yeah.
So I think that's great. I think there are two things that we think are relevant to the question of children and family in looking at how people are dating and entering romantic relationships today. And the first one is that, like with many other arenas in our lives today, we are expected to temporally, let's put it this way, save all the serious stuff to as late as possible.
Right.
So your 20s are about self-exploration, self-establishment, self-discovery, and that's particularly true romantically. That's also true professionally. We can talk about that. But certainly what you're not supposed to do is be dating with a view to establishing a very serious relationships early on. And that's for a good reason, because you're not formed yet. You don't know who you are. You need to still figure that out. So the first thing we have is that these pressures of slow love, of letting yourself mature and develop, and also, as you say, kind of being hyper vigilant about compatibility, maximizing and optimizing your position on the dating market so that the person you end up with is just right for you, in a very kind of market logic sense of right. So that's one thing that's going on, and that's creating a lot of postponement. And one of the things that we want to introduce with the book, which is, maybe a bit less dramatic than people not having kids because of climate change, is that we think a lot of people are having fewer kids than they want to, and often no kids at all, precisely because of all the pressures to postpone, not just having kids, but even starting to think about kids.
Sure.
So what happens, you're not encouraged to even start thinking about kids. Just ask your son at the University of Chicago, how many people there were about to have the life course that he had?
Yeah.
You're not even encouraged to think about kids until very late. And at this point, so for a lot of women, that's like they're early, maybe even mid-30s. And at that point, they're supposed to start dating with a view to finding a partner. And then, you have to go through all the courtship stages. That's supposed to take a long time because you have to make sure this is the right choice and only then have kids. Suddenly you're already coming up against certain kind of biological facts, and maybe having kids, and certainly unassisted, would be difficult. And that gets us to the other part that we emphasize in our examination of scripts of modern love. And that's something that I was saying before, we found out something very new in the research of the book. This blew us away. And it was the fact that women in particular today conceive of relationships. So you're asking, what is love for? As essentially separate, a romantic timeline that's separate from the family timeline.
Yeah.
So we quote a wonderful study, also by former U Chicago students, that looked at women who froze their eggs or thinking about freezing their eggs and considering that procedure. And it asked them, why are you doing it? Expecting what? Expecting to hear they wanted to extend their career possibilities. That's what we think of why women are freezing their eggs. And they found out something completely different. Most of the women were freezing their eggs in order to separate the romantic track and pursuits from the family ones. Because if you aim in dating, in seeking that partner, to starting a family, you are debasing the romantic relationship. You're instrumentalizing love.
Yeah.
So while for previous generations, it was always a fraught question. How does passionate romantic love going to come together with family? But there was some idea that in dating and seeking that partner, I'm keeping in mind or directly aiming at finding a partner with whom I want to start a family.
Sure.
Today, that's understood as something that's going to, right? It's going to be counterproductive. Now you're dating. What does that mean? You're not just postponing dating seriously. When you're dating seriously, you're taking everything into consideration: their political stance, their bank account, their position on prenup, their parents, where they want to live, their profession. The one thing you're not taking into account and you're not raising is whether or not they want to have kids.
Yeah.
And that's real. People told us, I was like, how long does it take you to raise the question? As long as possible. And that too creates circumstances, not ideological ones. These aren't people
Yeah.
who are thinking, I don't want to have kids for those reasons. Create circumstances in which the question of children is being raised later and later and later. And increasingly, as we say, the decision is being made for people and not by people.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
let me reintroduce you, and then I'm going to get to Rachel here because I know you had something. I'm in conversation with Frank Schaeffer. I am Frank Schaeffer. My guests are Anastasia Berg and Rachel Wiseman, who have written an incredible book, and it's called "What Are Children For?" And it's going to be in our It Has to Be Read book club sometime in July, which we will keep you all informed about. And you know, what I love about this book is it's bringing up all the questions we're now discussing, and I want to keep going on this. And Rachel, did you have something you wanted to jump in terms of just what?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to something that Anastasia said, which is that it's not just a matter of young people today not like treating things too casually, right? In fact, it's the opposite. So in some part, this is a reaction to the sort of hookup culture, the awareness that many marriages don't last, right? So people feel like they have to take a lot of put a lot of effort on the front end to eliminate risk in their relationships.
Yeah.
This is where the compatibility obsession can kind of come in, where you need to make sure that you have, you know, the right partner. It's not just a matter of kind of, yeah, like having lots of hookups and not wanting to commit. In fact, in some ways, the bar for commitment is really, really high.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that people feel like they need to wait until their relationships hit some sort of unknown level of connection before they can take these big steps.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, we talk about some of the narratives and movies that have like figured into the millennial imagination about love, and one of them is the series Twilight, where having children is seen as actually like a threat to the bond. It's a test of the bond between the two main characters. So it's only when they achieve this real sense of connection, commitment to one another, that one can even begin to contemplate, you know, what it would mean to have this threat of the child introduced.
It's not just a test. What's amazing about Twilight, and we really cannot underestimate how popular and influential that series was. What's amazing about it is that they have a child only when they're married, and it's a complete shock. It's a surprise. So again, the idea that children aren't something to be aimed at, right? These characters they didn't get together so they can start a family. The family comes and is a shock, even though, you know, they did everything necessary in order to become pregnant. And I just wanted to add one thing. What Rachel said reminded me is that what's lost in this narrative is not only the possibility of making the choice for you, but it's also the fact that developing, finding yourself, figuring out who you are, and even working within and on your relationship, those are things that could be happening in the context of having a family. So there's something quite misleading or potentially misleading about the idea that all the ducks have to be lined up. All the things in a life have to be, you're sort of testing yourself from everyone else. And only when you're already complete and finished and everything is set and your career set and your personal life is set, only then can you have kids, as opposed to an idea of having the children and developing with them. And I can attest, as somebody who had children, like many in my generation did, in my sort of mid 30s, you know, it's in many ways, I often think about how hard it is to have a child later because I am so established. There's so much in my life that's already set. I have such, you know, hard-earned habits. Yeah.
Well, and that would go for relationships too, by the way, in the sense that, you know, this wait until you meet the right person. Okay, now you're cast in concrete and stainless steel. You've established all your habits. God forbid they want to do other things. You know, whereas getting together younger, you that may not work, but if it does, you grow together, you grow up together, you form together. I think it's very similar to parenthood. You were going to jump in there. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say one way to put it is like for previous generations, it was understood you would court maybe for a while and then fall in love quickly. Now it's you court you maybe like court for a little bit, but then you fall in love very slowly, right? People move in together before they're willing to like totally commit to one another.
Sure.
It's, you know, it's drawn out.
At one point in the book, you say slow love can turn out to be a losing strategy. It doesn't just threaten the possibility of finding love, which
Yeah.
always involves sacrifice of opportunities and exposure to chance. It might actually stand at cross purposes with what many people still hope their relationship will eventually enable, serious commitment. I think that's a really well taken point. And again, I would just tell people that this book, What Are Children For, is also what is love for, but also is an analysis of, I mean, you're sort of like, I can never say your name right, Twingy or Twing, how do you say, you know, who does all these
Jean
statistical.
Twenge.
Jean Twenge, that's right.
Yeah.
Jean Twenge. I'm terrible on pronouncing names. I'm terminally dyslexic.
Same.
So Jean Twenge has written all these things, very much of an overlap with what you're doing in some ways. But what interests me about her look at this is the kind of trepidation generationally with every passing generation. Everyone seems to be more worried about what former generations just took as basic living. I mean, love, kids, you did this stuff, you young, okay, it doesn't work, you get divorced, you move on. The worry about giving offense or doing the wrong thing somehow that will color the rest of your life, that, you know, it's a series of slow steps to the point where, as a cynical old guy at 72 years old, I look at this and say, has anybody broken the news to these folks that life is short, goes really quickly, and that all these stages, that noise you hear is doors slamming behind you? So it's not just a generational difference in the view of, you know, love, marriage, children, no marriage, and so forth. It's kind of a view of everything. You know, I was talking about my son, John, who went to the University of Chicago, having been in combat in Afghanistan. And it was interesting when he came back, because he went right out of high school, and he proposed to Becky, and they married quickly, and she had 3 kids before she launched her career completely. And then Jeannie and I, my wife and I, did childcare. I asked John one day, you know, why did you decide to do this? And he said, well, Becky said she wanted children soon. And I learned one thing in combat in Afghanistan, and that is life is short and dangerous. And I've always wanted to be married and be a father. And I decided anything you really want, you better do now. And it was really interesting to me. Now, they've been married for 15 years and it's all working out, but it was so, what he learned as an individual in combat, if you want to put it that way, was so different than everything your book is talking about. And he's not that old. He was born in 1980, so he's getting older, but he's not of my generation. I was born in 1952, and yet his view of the brevity of life and the fatality of life in terms of just this is it. This is not a dress rehearsal. So different than everything you're describing in your book.
Yeah.
What Are Children For? I just bring that up because you all are connected to the University of Chicago, and your paths cross there with my son. I don't know if that contributes to the conversation.
No, I think it really does, because I think it allows us to say something that we've, again, learned in thinking through this book, which is that today, instead of the kind of thing you want to make sure that you get to do in your life, children have become the danger.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the things I think about a lot is the way in which children are seen as both sort of the capstone of a successful life. It's almost like a bonus round. Like maybe you'll get to it if you're good enough with everything else, and maybe not, and that's okay. But they certainly are perceived as sort of the end of life as you know it. So the thought is you have to get your travel in, right? All the things that when they hear that kind of statement from your son, they would think, well, yeah, I need to get my travel in and my career in. Everything needs to come in before I have the kids, because that will be the end. And what for me was a real kind of shift is realizing, well, you know, if you have kids young and they're old by the time or they're grown up by the time you're in your 40s. I mean, today we think of 40s as a time when you are living in every way possible, maybe to a kind of a ridiculous fault, who knows, but you certainly do. And that's something that's completely disappeared. So this possibility of thinking of a life that incorporates kids, that continues after you have children. There's a next chapter after your kids are out of the house. So I think that's completely lost today.
Yeah, and someone else brought this up in a blog post in a few years back. But every year that you delay having kids is one less year you get to spend with those kids or with those grandkids. So there is kind
Sure.
of a way that like people can in postponing having kids, it means also putting off those the time that you get to develop with another, with your family,
Yeah.
and be
Yeah.
present. My mother is a very active grandmother in my niece and nephew's lives, and that's been like a very important part of her,
Yeah.
60s. And I'm 35 and don't have kids yet, so when I do, it'll mean you know that time will be shorter with the kids
Yeah.
I and the
Yeah.
grandkids that I do have.
Yeah, which is something I think about a lot at 72, or be 72 in August, in the sense that, um, my daughter, Jessica, dropped out of NYU when she was 21, moved to Finland with her boyfriend Donnie, who's a jazz pianist and composer. They got married. She had her two children, then finished university in Finland,
Mhm.
did everything backward according to what you analyze in your book. Um, Now, when she wrote me an email a while back because I was asking her about this subject because it's one I'm so interested in. And she was saying, when she's asked how she managed to become a CEO of a financial corporation in New York City and has offices in Belgium and Italy, what played a part in that? And she says, well, really, I didn't learn anything in university and business world about this. The most of what I know, and she says you can always hear a pin drop, and then there's embarrassed looks when she says this. She says most of what I know about managing a corporation, I learned as a young mother and from my children. So she completely reversed the process. She didn't do it on purpose, as in I want to, tell everybody to get lost and do it my own way. But she was enough of a free thinker back when she was doing this. She's 54 now. That so I have somebody in my family. I have two of my three children, kind of either through happenstance or deliberately, did things that are counter to what you're writing about, which has made me really think about what you're writing about, because I realize that they are very much in a minority at this point in terms of their own generations. Anyway, I want to get to another quote in your book. What are children for? By the way, just a footnote on the way past that Ernie, my producer, sent me. One of the people we interviewed recently, and we have her book in our book club, is Kat Bohannon's book, Eve, How the Female Body Drove 200 Million Years of Human Evolution. So we talked a lot with Kat about her book, and we've made her book part of our book club. I just wondered if you know her book at all, if you run into it. I didn't check your footnotes to see if you reference it.
No, I haven't
It's
read
a
that
good
one.
book.
No,
Yeah, it's really good.
that's cool. Thank you.
Anyway, so shout out for Kat. Let me read something here, another section. And I want to, this is a bit more personal, and I want to dive in on which of you wrote this and talk about it. Somebody in your book is writing, I took comfort in ambivalence. The rejection of easy certainty seemed like the intelligent attitude to take toward a responsibility so big. It felt prudent and sensible to approach motherhood just like this, carefully, introspectively, sidelong, keeping in mind all the risks and trade-offs. The ambivalence was its own mode of sophistication, the poise of a thinking person. But not knowing was starting to make me unhappy. And privately, I wondered if it would ever end. Tired of wavering, one day I caved and called my mom. I asked how she came around to deciding that she wanted a family. I always knew, she told me. It was never a question. And so that's early in the book. And I just want to talk about the history of that paragraph. Tell us, unpack that a little for us. What's that about?
So that's in the introduction that I wrote. And just as a sidebar, the book is structured. It's bookended by personal essays. So I wrote the introduction that sort of talks about my own feelings of ambivalence and thinking through this question and realizing that it is a really big question.
Sure.
And then Anastasia concludes with her personal essay that's about when she became a mom. And
Yeah.
then there are four chapters in the middle that are written in kind of a joint, more
Yeah.
analytical voice. And so that passage is capturing this moment in my life when I was in my late 20s, early 30s, and realizing that um, the ambivalence that I felt, I felt that I probably wanted kids. I had no idea really how to make it happen. It didn't seem urgent. I was waiting for it to feel urgent. I was told there would be some kind of urge that would just come over me like a biological need or something at some point, and it just didn't. And so and and so there was also this narrative that I felt like I realized that I was sort of subscribing to, which was that like, well, if you're not sure, you have to be really sure. And it's important to know and have these reasons and justifications for like why you should make this big change if you're not absolutely certain. Um, and so you can see this, uh, this narrative in like the motherhood ambivalence literature that I was,
Sure.
reading a lot at the time, where it felt as though in order to be, you know, uh, that the intellectual position for a woman was one of uncertainty, and not an uncertainty and that you could move through, but that it was never really embracing kind of both the positive and the negative at the same time, moving through it
Yeah.
and living through it, but instead to like almost make a kind of lifestyle of this um, kind of confusion and negativity. And that is
Yeah.
not how I wanted to live. I wanted to be able to feel like I was in control of my life in some sense and making choices. And so, yeah, so I called my mom at some point, and she always knew that she wanted to be a mom. It was understood. She always pictured herself that way, and it wasn't something that occurred to me in the same way. And in talking to other people of our generation, my friends, it really did seem like a lot of us were stuck in this almost malaise of unknowing.
Mm.
And so the fact that it is a question in the way that we experience it today is something that feels quite new. And that was something that we really wanted to unpack in the book.
Mm. Let me ask you something. It's uh, one section of the book that really fascinated me. Well, it's not just one section, you get into it, but of course, you also write a very coherent history of some of the, you kind of review some of the feminist thinking, going way back when, but in the 1970s and 80s and so forth, that kind of framed this uncertainty we now have lived to see, although I think a lot of the younger people you're talking about may not have even heard of some of these people unless they've done a women's study program or something. And you talk about French feminist Elisabeth, is it Badinette? How do you say her name?
Badinter. I'm not a French speaker,
Yeah,
but
well, I can speak French and I still
yeah,
can't pronounce it.
yeah.
Observed in her 2010 book, The Conflict, quote, in a civilization that puts the self first, motherhood presents a challenge, even a contradiction. When parenthood gets pitted against individual freedom, the choice to have children becomes a matter of personal preference. And then she goes on, the individualism and hedonism that are hallmarks of our culture have become the primary motivations for having children, but also sometimes the reason not to. For a majority of women, it remains difficult to reconcile increasingly burdensome maternal responsibilities with personal fulfillment. Of course, that's kind of the deep background that frames a big chunk of your book in the same way the slow love really leads into the what are children for. We're not living in a period of history that has been shaped by kind of neutral, ambivalent forces when it comes to children. You have what you would call the far radical Marxist left of the feminist movement, all the way up to just a younger generation that now is scared about the environmental issues and so forth and so on. Um, I'm a pretty good student of history, and I can't think of a period, certainly Renaissance Italy wouldn't qualify, and Enlightenment France, they might have had the guillotine going nicely and with Robespierre and the rest of them, but nobody was questioning what you would call the basic biological anatomy of the human condition and fertility clocks and so forth. None of these things were issues, but we have a post-Enlightenment theoretical bulwark that questions everything anyway. And then into that mix in the 20th century particularly begins to come this idea that that Kat Bohannon gets into her book, Eve, by the way, and that is just simply the biological reality of bearing children can't be glossed over. This is a tough proposition. It's one that can kill you. And then in addition to which now maybe we've destroyed our planet, so we shouldn't have children anyway. What I'm trying to say is that there's a big chunk of your book that takes us very deeply into some of the theoretical ideas, some of which are pretty far-fetched in terms of questioning everything, up into including, should we just look to future technologies to take this whole baby thing out of everybody's hands? And while we're at it, let's abolish mothers anyway and have children raised on a sort of communal kibbutzim thing, much as the Soviets tried to raise children at some time. So that long preamble gets to the question. I'm really curious about you two, and I don't want to put you on the spot. Were some of what I would call the more outer fringe stuff that you put in your book there to give a context to the whole? Or in your own heads, are you saying, this is crazy, and I'm going to put this in just to show the breadth of thinking, and at the margins, some of this seems nuts? Or does it all seem reasonable to you and you just quote it and put it in there so that we can get an idea of the range of thinking on this subject?
So
I can't
if I
tell.
may, yeah, okay. So one of the hopes of the book, it's the most rewarding response we get to the book is when somebody says, this has helped me think through something that I didn't even know how to think through. And that is true sometimes of people who see the financial concerns as, unsurmountable obstacle. That's true of people who are looking at their lives and are just saying, I'm just not finding that partner, things that we've just been discussing. And it's also true of women in particular. How do I fit motherhood in my life, given that I think of myself as a liberal woman, a progressive woman, a woman who is concerned with some notion of equality, and we thought that the key to helping somebody like that understand what is this confusion. A lot of times these confusions aren't articulated even to the person themselves. We actually should show them how within the feminist discourse, this conversation took place in what was really a recent past. Today, this conversation isn't a part of a lively feminist discourse. Feminist writing today or activism is not particularly concerned with motherhood, but for a long time it was. And so a lot of times, I'm a philosopher by training, seeing an extreme position articulated really helps us understand sort of the limits of the conversation. It helps us understand the possibilities that one can take on this question. So we're not putting it there as either to just look at it and see, oh, how crazy this is, or to endorse it, but to help us see, okay, what is the kind of, why would you think that motherhood isn't compatible with feminism? And then answer it. In the same way that if you want to really think clearly through climate change concerns, you can't just dismiss them. You have to first say, okay, what is the challenge of climate change? What is it? So we analyze it, right? And then we can answer it. And so that's why those passages are there. But I will say something really important specifically about the kind of the things that you're pointing to, which is these attempts of this intuition that somehow if we want to free women, we have to free them from motherhood. So I think, interestingly, the place we end up in the book, it retains the good part of that intuition. And here it is. For too long, we think the question of whether or not you should have children has been understood as a women's issue. So although feminism, it's great. They were the only place that was asking this question of how do children fit into a human life. But it was also secluded. That question was sort of, compartmentalized as just something that women should be concerned with. this isn't just wrong when you're talking about your son and how much he wanted to have children, but it also, in fact, puts a burden on women. And that
Yeah.
burden is the burden of decision.
Hmm.
So as long as we think of the decision of having children as something that's just women's, the only there should be thinking about it. You know, books about this point today, a lot of them marketed to women. They're pink, they have flowers on them. They're
Yeah.
called women-y things. People oftentimes they read our book, which is very careful about not being just for women, to say, oh, it's about motherhood. And I say, no, it's about parenthood.
Hmm.
And when we don't acknowledge that, we're in trouble. And here's why we're in trouble. A woman today in a liberal progressive milieu coming up to the decision is facing a partner who, out of the conviction that he should be supportive of her freedom to choose,
Yeah.
thinks that this isn't a question that they should be asking themselves.
Yeah, I love there's a
So,
section in your book actually that addresses that, where I forget where it is in the book. And I don't want to spend my time scavenging through these notes here, but you actually say, to the point where even bringing this up almost seems like an imposition and, you know,
That's
could
right.
be a deal breaker. But in addition to which, it's like the men, the more liberal educated man, let's say, who sees himself as a liberal, is so deferential that, let's say, he is interested in having, you know, no, this is her decision.
That's right.
And so there's
And
this wall. It's not we. They're two me's, and one is the male, one's the female. And I love that bit of your book anyway.
so I just want to then kind of give the important line here, which is that I don't know about liberating women with artificial wombs. That's not an option, so I don't have to consider it. But we do want to liberate women from being the sole bearers of the burden of having to deal with the ethical question of whether or not children are legitimate, and the personal question within couples of whether or not we're going to have any kids.
Yeah, and you give this deep background, you know, quoting here, later feminist thinkers have sought to undermine the notion that motherhood is innate, but have shared Firestone's pessimistic reading of the institution under the current system and so forth. And I just wanted to point out to people who are listening to my podcast or watching it here that this book, What Are Children For?, is a multi-layered, wonderful book that brings up the deep history of, you know, where some of these views come from, how they were formed, and as a kind of almost anthropological study in some ways, if you look at us as a tribe that need to be studied by outsiders, you know, in a way, Anastasia and Rachel are those outside. They've come to study our tribe and tell us how we're behaving, whether it's dating or attitudes toward children. But then you give this deep history, and then you weave into that some of your own narrative of where you're individually coming from. I love that. You don't do what so many academic writers do, that I really hate academic books most of the time, because they hide behind their degree and you never learn who they are. And of course, it's like politicians saying they're neutral or journalists. They're humans too. You want to know, where the hell are you coming from? And I like that in the book. I know where both of you sort of come from, but at the same time, you are studiously objective in presenting what Anastasia was talking about, just like, here it is, this is what was said. So I want to turn to a kind of a philosophical question here, and that is, when you look at the demographics, you know, for instance, I have had a whole bunch of people like Brad Wilcox, who studied marriage trends, and his book Get Married, or Tomorrow's People by Paul Moreland. I'm just looking at a whole stack of books here. I've got the people I've interviewed or will be interviewing. You know, we all know the 1.7 figure is not going to reproduce, and America's now at 1.7 children per population. Korea, South Korea, and Japan look like they will cease to exist if you do the math. What's interesting to me is so much of your book is about people's feelings about these issues, rather than about the facts of actual fertility clocks. Whereas, you know, a woman's fertility from 18 through 23 is easier. From 23 to 30 gets a little harder. From after that, it's tougher. By 40, you're doing weird things if you want to have a child, unless you're very lucky, and it's very expensive. Similarly, we're discussing all this in theory. Meanwhile, demographers across the globe are saying, when you get old, you being the young person, you do realize there will be no young people to support you, to take care of you, or pay the bills. I know that's I'm being a little over dramatized here. So I want to turn to something else, and that is, beside the interviews you have done, this kind of sense that our personal lives are not going to impact us when we're 30 years down the road. And we've all learned, there's a lot of research on the fact that loneliness is a killer. The way I would put it is, if you're lonely, evolution wants you dead. And it has no use for you, because evolution isn't God, doesn't love you. There's no answers to prayer. Evolution only gives a shit about one thing, and that is the propagation and the continuance of life. And this sort of rolling over, the entire system is designed not for people who are into themselves only, but who are, shall we say, living according to some, biological reality. And at some point, ideas, schmideas, you're running up against fertility clocks, you're running up against demographics, you're running up against, all these crazy racists who say we don't want to be replaced. Well, evolution has a wonderful plan for your life. You're going to be alone, and you're not going to like it. And the Canadian border is open, and euthanasia is legal up there now for people who are just depressed. The future does not look good when you play out the big strokes that evolution plays, which is for keeps, against our kind of narcissism of like, oh, how do I feel about this? Slow love, maybe live with somebody for a while, see how that went. It just seems to me, you didn't say this in the book, but it just seems to me, looking at this from a very hard-ass point of view, this doesn't bode well. How does this all end? Where does this play out? And I don't know if you two have given it any thought. And I've exaggerated my own view here to get a good response from you, because I know you've thought about this. You must have.
Rachel, do you want to go?
You go ahead, I'll add. Yeah.
Well, I would say this. First of all, prophecy is for fools. We know that.
Yes. And so is futurism. It doesn't work out. I read Alvin Toffler back in the day. I know all about it, but I just want to know how you think about it.
No. But I do want to respond to what you're saying. So here's something interesting about these kind of projections into the future. And they're the same. They go back to what Rachel was saying, which is young people today wanting to, some guidance for this decision. What are the kind of narratives that they see? One of the things they hear about is how not having kids globally is going to make pensions impossible.
Yeah, sure.
And it's kind of encountering the narratives that you were giving voice to right now. That kind of knowledge does not seem to help people think through the question of what shape they want their lives to take.
Yeah.
It doesn't. And for us, our ambition, our aim was to address that, was to address the kind of confusion. And then from that standpoint, one can ask the question of where does the rest of humanity fit in? Where it fits in our narrative, we haven't spoken about sort of the positive argument that we give in response to the kind of most philosophical, most abstract antinatalist challenges. And in that answer, we do want to invite us not to return, but maybe recover a modern understanding of human life as it was once understood, which is essentially generational. Which means, human beings used to understand themselves as essentially having a past and essentially having a future. Once you think of us and you remind ourselves that in the question of children, we're not just asking, it's not just a consumer choice. We're really asking this deep philosophical question, which is there value to human life in the future? What you're talking about, what is the human future going to look like? There is an opportunity for each of us to contribute to that human future. And you can do it in many ways. You could with political activism, you could be pursuing knowledge, you could be an artist. But one very fundamental way of doing it, fundamental because it's the basis for any kind of possibility of a robust human future, is the way I put it is take one for team humanity, right? You do your own little share in bringing about and nurturing and caring and educating and raising morally 1, 2, 3 members of the next generation.
Sure.
And so I think in our account, it's not that humanity and the future of humanity doesn't fit in. I think it does fit in, but I think the way to bring it in is by thinking precisely from the standpoint of an individual, considering what am I here for and what am I doing? And again, what shape I want my life to take.
And that doesn't require thinking necessarily, in terms of these big grand narratives. It can mean affirming the things that you do in your life today, right? Like having children is a way of committing to a future that you can believe in. But we do that every day with the things that we're already, engaging in. The fact that we do political work, the fact that we have friendships, all of this is premised on the possibility of a human future. So it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be necessarily some kind of like apocalyptic realization, but something that, emerges from the lives that we're living in the present.
Yeah, and you sort of end your book there. I want to go a little longer if you have some time here, and not just cut this off on the hour. I don't know. Do you both have a couple extra minutes?
We
Sure.
do. I do.
Good. Because I just don't want to, Ernie, I just need to go a little longer on this. This is such an important book. You bring up so many good things, and I'm encouraging people. In July, we're going to be doing this as part of our It Has to Be Read book club. It seems to me one thing you don't get into in the book, except obliquely. I mean, you sort of mentioned, yes, this has to do with some males too. You're talking to women, not because you've written a book for women. This is a book that anyone of any gender or any persuasion can read, whether you have a child or not. It's just so well written and well researched. It's a history book as well as so much more. But it seems to me that, speaking as a 72-year-old male, father and grandfather, that I place a huge burden of blame, if I can be straightforward, on something that'll sound a little odd to you, but I'll put it this way. There's a wonderful book that's been a touchstone in my life called The Old Way by Elizabeth Marshall Thomas, who lived in the 1950s with the Kung Bushmen in the Kalahari Desert, and her father was the co-founder of Raytheon. And for reasons unknown, in 1950, he took a couple years off and headed for the Kalahari Desert and said, all the indigenous people of the world are disappearing. I want to study them. And he took his wife with him and his daughter, who was then 19, and they took notes. And if it wasn't for the misogynist bullshit artists who run places like Harvard's anthropology departments and other people, Elizabeth Marshall Thomas's book, The Old Way, would be the book. She's better than Margaret Mead, better than anybody. They lived with them. She took notes. This is the book. And if you read The Old Way, and I know this is a long preamble, she and Elizabeth and her mother, the notes they took present a hunter-gatherer society that had been in the same place in the Kalahari, provably, demonstrably, for 80,000 years. That's 80,000, not 8,000. 80,000 years had been doing the same thing. One of the things they did was a complete egalitarian childcare society between male and female. And it's amazing when you read her book, just the notes they took and their observations. And remember, these were notes made in the 1950s. So this is way pre any kind of feminist agenda to find what you want to find, as academics do, just like everybody else. And what amazed me as somebody who's arrived at the happiest stage of their own life as a grandfather doing childcare wasn't that this is some new touchy-feely male post-feminist thing. I'm actually doing what these hunter-gatherers male did in this clan that they lived with for months and months and months in the 1950s. And they were the first outsiders that had ever been there, ever. And what they found was men doing childcare. What they found was young boys and young girls sharing, working with and playing with babies. What they found was women who were gathering, who were in charge of a big chunk, who had, quote, careers, if you want to put it that way, commensurate and equal to the men. The men were hunters, but it was the women who kept the poison arrows and gave them out before every hunt and divided the meat when it came back. What these people had done in 80,000 years is basically do everything that modern people think we are aiming for. It's been done. And the book really changed the way I see my own life. And I'm just sorry that it isn't something that's more widely known, although it doesn't contradict anything. It's not something new. But anyway, in The Old Way, what the question I want to frame to you both is this, and that is that it seems to me that the modern male in the post-industrial society and the technical society we live in and post-agrarian and so forth and so on has lost touch, not with some modern feminist ideal, but in fact with the way things were and how we evolved to be. And, you know, people get into this in the study of the bonobos and the survival of the friendliest and all these other ideas. But as a male who has found tremendous meaning in my children, and even especially in my grandchildren, I feel so sorry for men in this culture that think that family is a woman's thing. They're crazy. It's a male thing, and caring and sharing with your children, and what the pleasure of the fact that Jack will show up next week to help build a new deck with me. He's 13. And that my granddaughters, you know, help me rebuild my barn. You know, this isn't some unusual, touchy-feely, nice old grandfather. This is the way it's always been. And somehow we got away from that. And I know, you know, you haven't written that book because you're addressing other issues, but I want to ask you both, you know, State of the Union type question. What is the state of the union when it comes to men and how they view these issues? Because I think we're, excuse the language, totally fucked. I think that right now is a very bad time to be a male in so many ways. And you're writing to women, but I look at, you know, I go to pick up grandchildren at school, and I look around and it's a bunch of moms standing in the play yard and we're there picking them up. Maybe a grandfather comes in once in a while. You hardly see the fathers. And my question to you is, do you understand that the way you have set your lives up is you have missed everything good? You have eaten the wrapper. You've thrown away the fucking candy. You're idiots, because this is the best part of my life. And it has a direct bearing on your book. And one reason I really like it. Enough of the speech. Sorry.
Well, this sounds like the book you should write. It sounds like men would definitely enjoy and benefit a lot from it. I will take umbrage at one thing you said, which is that this is a book for women.
Oh,
This
no, I
is
didn't mean
not,
that it's a book for women, but it is written by women addressing an issue that will be taken as a book for women, which you guys said yourselves. That's what I meant.
and one of the 100%, I'm being only facetious when I say umbrage, but one of our ambitions is to take or to do our very little share. It's one book, and the cultural forces we're up against are huge, as you have been describing. But to take the one step that we can in the direction of destabilizing this convention, according to which this is a book or this is an issue for women.
Sure.
The question of the financial viability is not one that only concerns women. The question of the difficulty of finding the suitable and willing partner, in fact, as we say in the book, is the second most common reason that childless people give for why they didn't have kids after I didn't feel like having any in both the US and the UK without gender differentiation. And the climate question, or let's kind of, here's a little spoiler for the book, the real philosophical question of whether or not the world is so full of suffering, and whether or not human beings are so rotten and evil that we should not be reproducing, that's not a women's question, that's a human question.
Yeah, sure.
So it's true that we have to go through, as you pointed out, the history of the feminist conversation. But we do that in order to land where? To land at a place where we can say, if we really give respect and really take seriously the feminist message, we realize this isn't a feminist conversation, because men have to be taking equal part, not just in the parenting, like you're saying, which is incredibly important. But, you know, in some circles, we kind of know men are supposed to be doing the same, doing as much, but we don't think that they should be asking themselves early, vibrantly, you know, kind of wholeheartedly, do I want kids? And making room for their partners and saying that, because here's something that's true of our circles. Everyone knows that men are supposed to be doing the dishes, but everyone also knows that men aren't supposed to be, you know, saying too much about how many kids they want.
Yeah.
But when a person does not take responsibility for the decision, it's that much harder to then take an active part in the actual practice, right? I didn't decide it. You decided this. So I actually take what we're doing to be a really important corrective from our little, you know, from a little perspective to what you're talking about. Because I think that with all the recognition to the good intentions that lead us to think of it as a women's issue, we want to be recognizing the challenges on women. We want to be recognizing the difficulties they're facing. We want to be giving them kind of in groups within which they can discuss the issue. The truth is, when we think of it as a question of motherhood, I really think we're harming men and women
Yeah, I
from
agree.
exactly the way you put it, taking part in a deeply fulfilling human practice that also has this really significant ethical weight on it. It's not just the point isn't just like men and women don't get to have the experiences they want. I think men and women are getting a perverse orientation to a human future.
And
Yeah,
I do have a
Rachel,
lot of
weigh it in.
sympathy. I do have a lot of sympathy for men. I think they don't know how to enter into these conversations at all. And they don't feel like they have a place. They don't even know how to begin to formulate those ideas for themselves and what it would mean for them to take responsibility as, you know, a man, as a partner. And so I do think that, you know, they can end up feeling creepy, out of place, not leery. And so one of the things that we hope to do with the book is to give men an opportunity to think seriously for themselves about what the stakes of this question are. And only then can they enter into those conversations with their partners and with their families and friends.
Yeah, well, you know, the reason I'm so taken with this book is I think you've succeeded in that. I really, it pulled me right through, and I've learned so much from it. I want to get to kind of just a general issue here and talk to you both about this. It seems to me that, you know, maybe this is the perspective of the 72-year-old rather than the younger person. As I look at some of the pessimism we are surrounded with, particularly in the US, there's an interesting article in The Atlantic from yesterday about the fact that we are exporting anxiety worldwide via social media, and that non-English speaking countries have far less anxiety than English speaking countries because they can't read social media posts by American kids. Parenthetically,
it's so bleak.
Yeah, and that are taking everybody with them. But, you know, it seems to me that either because people don't read history or just don't have any sense of proportion that they're part of a human story, that there's a kind of a bleak view of, you know, how could you have kids now? How can you bring kids into this world? Excuse me, you know, when the Black Death took half of Europe and you're in the 12th century and the Renaissance hasn't happened yet, it didn't look too good then. People still had children. I am not a pessimist. I'm an optimist about the future. I think that we have all kinds of huge problems facing us, but the possibilities are immense. You know, I go in a completely different direction. I think as a North American, this is the best possible moment to be alive and to be having children and to grasp the future. Not because everything is in good shape, but I even think that if Donald Trump gets elected again, which I will cringe and have a heart attack and take 3 extra blood pressure pills. But that said, you know, the human race has survived. Here we are. This is where we're at. How do you both feel about this sort of pessimistic idea that why would we possibly want to bring a child into this world as if somehow this is a novel or original question, given the history of the human race? I mean, I was born in 1952, a few years after the end of World War II. You know, we had Jews stay with us when I was a child in my parents' community that had tattoos on their arms, and they would tell me stories. They went on and started families again. Younger people then. I just think that we are hysterical, and these, I don't mean the issues of your book, but this kind of dark view of a future. Does it have to do with social media, everybody trading their stories, these little, you know, wedges of conspiracism and all the rest of it we live in? I don't know what it is, but as an older person who's lived long enough to see the cycle of my own life, all the terrible things that were going to happen that didn't, and how things tend to work out, I just think there has to be some voices in there saying, be brave, step forward, seize the day, be a human being, you know, share the joys that have always been shared by humans. We're no different than previous generations, whether we have iPads and cell phones or not. Life goes on, and I don't know how to break through that for males or females or anybody else, but I just wonder what your views, both of you as authors, are who've written this book about that kind of pessimistic view of the future that suddenly becomes a question, well, should I even have children, even if I want them? And you bring that up in your book, but I don't know what your views are. I mean, I know how the book ends and you affirm the joy of family, but I wonder if that triggers any thoughts.
Yeah. So I'll say this. I think it's easy to take a concern, and I think that's true also of concerns people had at the times of the Black Death, probably.
Yeah.
If we see them, we think some of them are silly. Um, uh, but interestingly enough, I think you can't get people to change their minds with just like a fact check.
No.
Or and if somebody's very upset, it's, as we know, it's usually not encouraging them if we just tell them like, but look at this guy and he had a much worse life. So I share your I think both of us share that the starting intuition, which is this kind of finding a fact remarkable that today, at a time where people are enjoying comfortable lives, and people who are raising these concerns are oftentimes the people who are enjoying the comfortable lives, they're raising these really deep existential concerns and are very pessimistic about the future. The difference might be that for the sake of this book, what we want to do is treat it as a puzzle. Why is that the case? Because dismissing it is one thing, but let's first try to understand it if we really want to address it. And so we look at the very long history of antinatalist concerns and we ask, what's special about our moment? So first of all, yeah, we recognize we're not the first one to ask this. It's always been the case that people were sort of wondering, is there justification for this project to go on? And yet today something is different. What we think is different is that today it's the kind of thing that people, kind of ordinary people, take themselves to have some kind of response to. But I want to say something else about this, which is that our attitudes towards the future are almost always a reflection of attitudes towards the present. So the question we should be asking is not, why are people today, given the projections of where we will be in 100 years, don't want to have kids? We should be asking, what is life like for the people who are raising the concern today that they don't want to reproduce it? And that's not sometimes a measure of, the kind of questionnaire happiness, the happiness they report in a questionnaire. It's not a measure of economic well-being. I think sometimes what it is a reflection of is a kind of loss of faith in the meaning and value of what we're doing. It's not the how. There's a lot of that stuff we're up to. It's the inability to say why are we doing all these things? And when we don't have that kind of justification, where the fact of human life and the goodness of human life is really a question in the present, it expresses itself as this pessimism, or we would even say fantasies about not having a future, about being the last generation on Earth. Now, that might seem indulgent, but I think that, a spiritual malaise can happen at a time of decadence. A spiritual crisis can happen in the midst of a lot of comfort. And so, and that's not a reason not to address it, because as you're saying, people are choosing to be the last of their lines. They don't want to take part. They want to take one for the team, like I was saying before. They want to take part in this project of perpetuating human life. And so what we want to help them. Rachel was sort of saying something to this effect earlier. We want to help them recognize that insofar as they're able to recognize the goodness in their own lives, commit to projects in the present, that's a perspective from which they already see the goodness of a human future.
Yeah. And you can see this pessimism really starkly in this like spate of eco-dystopian novels that have become quite popular recently, that we talk a little bit about in the 4th chapter of the book. Where that decadence that Anastasia was talking about is part of the crisis, right? People feel that there is nothing really to speak for about modern life aside from our addiction to these phones or these objects, or our acquisitiveness. So the portrait that ends up getting kind of shown about what it means to be a human today is often one that's quite, degraded. And so one of the things that we try to do in the book is to ask ourselves, well, why is that what we land on? And what would it mean to kind of experience human life as having some sense of meaning and purpose again. And you know, one thing that we also discuss is to the extent that there have been these narratives that have these arguments that have tried from a kind of progressive perspective to justify having kids today, they always do so with a recourse to hope.
Yeah.
But in doing so, they seem to say that, well, there's nothing good about the lives that we're living now. We're capitalist consumers, but maybe a future generation will figure out a better form of life than the one that we're living now. And ultimately, that's not really gonna suffice, because it doesn't give you a reason to reproduce something and still a certain kind of vision of what a good life would be for the next generation.
Yeah, you're really onto something there. And I think the dissatisfaction and the malaise, if you want to put it that way, is less about a sort of a measurable economic status, especially for educated people with opportunity. It's a dim view of the future, but kind of reminds, you know, when you think of a philosopher like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who made these grand statements about humanism and France and all the rest of it, and then you look at his personal life, and it was a disaster, the way he treated people, abandoned his children, awful to women, same with Picasso and so many intellectual figures. There's a kind of a weird sense here of this generation has an easier time looking at the big issues, the ecological future of the planet, but they can't figure dating out. And so I think a lot of the malaise, I think a lot of the looking at the big issues as, oh, well, I can't do this because of that, is really a cover up for something much deeper. And that is that we have specialized in looking for joy in all the wrong places. And the first wrong place in terms of my life experience is that my happiness is what I'm looking for. You know, I've been married a long time to Jeannie. We've been together now for 54 years. And one of the reasons through ups and downs and the fact that, you know, she married a person who had basically been groomed to be an asshole by divine right. That was me as a young man coming out of an evangelical background. The reason we were there is that somewhere along the way, we both discovered the fact that the most joy we felt was by really bringing joy into somebody else's life. It flipped it. And I think a lot of the problem today with people who feel that life is not worth continuing, if you want to put it dramatically, in terms of having children, is that our culture, besides being decadent, besides the ecological future that looms, has sold us a kind of a psychological blueprint that doesn't work. And that is that lives lived that are all about me and all about my happiness, the more you pursue that, the further you will get from your goal. And, you know, one of the good things of having a child is it forces you to actually concentrate on someone else's happiness for a while. And then you wake up one morning realizing that, you know, I'm happier because you've made someone else happy. You know, I think that our culture has specialized in a kind of a selfishness which darkens the entire picture, and that it's easier to talk about ecological disaster than really look within and just say, this is not working, me personally. And in a way, your book calls people, I think, to take a look inward. I don't know what either of you think about what I've just said.
Rachel.
Yeah, I mean, I think the hope of the book is that, you know, for someone struggling with this decision, or for who is wondering, is this something that I can really take on for myself? It's such a big responsibility, such a risk. Am I too selfish to become a parent? That some of those concerns and confusions will get clarified over the course of the book, right? That, you know, what might seem like, you know, just selfishness could be actually a real kind of anxiety about security, about
Sure.
one's own capacity to, you know, nurture and raise another human being, a sense that there isn't necessarily something that they can like instill or pass on. And so I think that it is, I hope, a call for people to reflect on their lives and the values that they hold. And that itself can be liberating. It was for me, even in the process of writing the book.
Mm.
And I'll say this is in the spirit of what Rachel said. I mean, look, there might be an epidemic of selfishness, but there's also The possibility of looking at a lot of the things that we put the label of selfishness on
Hmm.
and looking at them in a different light, which, as you were really rightly pointing out, was our ambitious throughout with a lot of the narratives and analyses that we see around us. So, for instance, people wanting to have a really secure financial life before they have kids, that seems like quite a selfish thing to do. But you can as easily conceive of it as precisely a sign of a kind of insecurity. And in fact, the kind of a response to this pressure that people, and we've heard this from people, but they really do feel to give their kids as much as they had, more than they had, everything that's possible to give. And so, and I think the same happens when you look at the concerns of climate change and you look at people saying, I'm really worried about putting my kids in a planet that is not good as the one that I was in. I think what we need to recognize there is that there's operating in the background is this assumption that what I'm responsible for is as if like any misfortune and anything in the environment that my child will experience.
Mhm.
In philosophy, you'll see this is really like the contemporary analytic frame from which we evaluate whether or not we should have kids, is this thought, well, I'm responsible for whatever well-being they will enjoy throughout the course of their lives. From that perspective, it is really hard to justify having
Sure.
kids. It's hard to feel ready enough to have kids. The standard of readiness is so high and vague. What we invite people to do is to recall that what you're responsible in having a child is not just the child's well-being, no matter what happens. Human life, like you were alluding to, is always full of suffering, always full of
Sure.
possible tragedy. You're always inalienably vulnerable. Like we started this conversation, but you talking about being a parent with a child in facing war
Mm.
and in combat position. You can't, you haven't failed because this is the dangers your child is facing, and a parent whose child gets hurt, that's not what they're responsible for. What they're responsible for in becoming a parent is doing everything in their power to prepare their children to face whatever misfortune, whatever tragedy, and whatever failure they face. And
Mm.
so what we hope is by making this shift, reminding us what is the responsibility you're taking on in having a parent, we can ease some of those pressures and burdens that, as you said, a lot of times look like people are just being very, very self-protective.
Yeah, good point. Well, hey, we will wrap this up momentarily. I just want to not reintroduce you, but what do you call it? Just kind of talk a little bit about the book for a second. You have been listening to or are listening to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and my guests are Anastasia Berg and Rachel Wiseman, and they have written this incredible book on all the things we've been talking about. What are children for? And it's going to be in our book club in July. I really wish you well with this. I think I read a review in the New Yorker, perhaps, and that's why I contacted you. Thank you for responding so quickly. And I can't wish your book any better than I do. I really hope it becomes a bestseller and really widely read and discussed. I think it's a really important book. And I think in discussing with you now what you set out to do, all I can say is you've done it and some. And there's so much in the book more that we could have covered. But thank you, so much for writing it. And I just think it's terrific. You're both great. And this will be weird and quirky, but I liked your book so much that I was literally sipping my coffee before I came on with you, just saying, gee, I hope when I meet them and we talk that they're kind of people I really like, because I love their book and it's going to be a real bummer if I don't like them.
Oh no.
I want to go a step further and say, I love you both. I love your book. You
Thank you.
your personalities shine through. You're wonderful people. You're wonderful authors. You've written a terrific book. And now I'm massively relieved because I'm 100% behind you as well as behind your book. I know that's an odd way to finish an interview.
Thank you, Frank. We'll have to send you a copy. I know you had
Yes,
to read it on
I want a real
Kindle,
copy.
but this is what
Please.
it looks like.
Yes.
And so we'll get your address afterward.
Yeah, and
but-
when I go away here, stay for a minute and talk to Ernie to get all that, because we want to link to everything you're doing. And I'd love a hard copy because I'm very frustrated that I read it on Kindle. I want to dog ear the pages and mark the bits I love. So
We want a picture of the dog ears too.
you'll get it because we'll do
good.
another one of these. I'm going to have you back to promote your book some more when we do the book club or soon after. So please,
Absolutely love
please
to.
come
This is
back.
so much fun. Thanks for
Thank
having
you,
us,
Frank.
Yeah, you're wonderful people.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, much love. Bye.
Okay, bye. Take care.